USCHO.com. This is the USCHO Spotlight, a weekly podcast from U.S. College Hockey Online at USCHO.com, featuring conversations with college hockey coaches and players and journalists who cover the sport.
Welcome to USCHO Spotlight for Tuesday, January 19th, 2021. I'm Ed Trefzger alongside Jim Connelly. Notre Dame is perfect on the road, and 2 of those 4 wins came last weekend over the University of Minnesota.
And joining us this week on USCHO Spotlight, the head coach of the Notre Dame Fighting Irish, that's Jeff Jackson. And Jeff, great weekend. You're coming off a road sweep of the number 1 team in the country, Minnesota. It does seem since the new year and returning from your shortened holiday break, your team's playing some pretty good hockey right now.
Yeah, I think we've come together. We've had some really good moments at times throughout the year, but we've lacked consistency in being able to put it together for 60 minutes. We did it earlier in the year at Ann Arbor against Michigan, and we had that same discipline to play the full 60 minutes at Minnesota. Although they had a pretty good pushback in the latter periods on Saturday, but I liked our game. We were consistent in just about every aspect of our game, and that's just something that hasn't been all year.
I did get to see parts of both of your games this weekend, and you mentioned the pushback maybe in the third period of the second game, but it did seem that your team was composed, and on Friday night especially had a little bit of drive to get that winning goal and put away the first game, but then hold on the second game. What was your team's bench mentality as those games were going on? It seemed that there was a lot of positives you could take away from the way they performed in those games.
Yeah, there was no question. I mean, we showed some maturity, and that's something that maybe has been missing a little bit in the early stages of the year. And when I say maturity, it's just, how you're performing those key moments of the game. Sometimes they're created by penalties. Sometimes they're created by, like the game changed a little bit on Saturday night because of a block shot that Minnesota had that kind of changed the whole momentum of the game that we had, early on against them. So, it's situational awareness. It's penalties. It's, key things that just kind of influence how the game goes. And, you have to be able to deal with the ebbs and flows because they're going to happen in every game. You can't avoid them. So our guys handled it a lot better this weekend than I can remember for most of the year. And like I said, the last time was probably playing Michigan earlier in the year when we played, pretty composed game.
The offense has probably been the one thing that if you want to see some increase, I assume that's an area you'd like to see it. But when you're playing good defense, you can sometimes take care of that. Goals are there, and you've got plenty of guys that have scored goals at this point, but where can you maybe find a little bit more offense? Is it special teams? Is it just some 5-on-5 play? Is it just some, as you mentioned, kind of those little things, the discipline points of the game?
Well, the interesting thing is, Jim, is that, even in the early stages of the years, like we were done with our 10 games before Christmas, and, statistically, we had like 60 more scoring chances than our opponent. And it's frustrating, even though 2 games against Minnesota, like we did a pretty good job offensively of generating scoring chances. And obviously they're a good defensive team as well. And they have good goaltending. So, trying to score 3 goals against them is not an easy thing for any team. But the thing is, I thought for me, everybody always talks about us defensively, but our defensive game's based on our puck possession. I mean, we possessed the puck probably Friday night, like 60% of the game. And that's certainly the best defense of all. And people, often compare that to us being a good defensive team. But, if we possess the puck, and that's really, the game we want to play is we want to possess the puck and, defend when we have to, pressure the puck when we don't have it. But, I thought that, both nights, I thought we had, a number of good scoring chances and just had the inability to finish. And, you got to give Minnesota credit too. They've got a good defense and good goaltending. And, it made it hard to finish. But, I thought we had some really good looks that their goalie came up with big saves or, their defensemen would make really, really solid plays. So, but we do have to score more on the power play. This past weekend's the first time we've scored in a few probably in a month on the power play. And we had a goal each night. And that, if you look at 2 1-goal games, that's a huge difference for us. And that's the difference between winning and losing, especially on the road. Special teams and goaltending generally are the most important facets of the game on the road.
You mentioned goaltending, and as long as I've followed and covered your team, it feels like you've always been kind of that one goaltender team. You've had kind of that number one goaltender. This year, you've, for the most part, platoon. I look at 8 games played for both goaltenders, 7 results for each. But Ryan Bischel, a sophomore, Dylan St. Cyr, a senior. What have you gotten in terms of production out of both of them, and how have they maybe started to grow throughout this season, both getting opportunities in net?
Well, I think, first of all, the most important thing is that, nobody's really stepped up and grabbed the number one job. And that's, always what we're kind of waiting to see, who emerges as being a number one guy. And I'm not necessarily opposed to playing 2 guys if they're both playing really well. I prefer that, as long as we have somebody that's consistent, to me, that's the most important thing. And, I think that when I talk about consistency, that's one area that we have not been consistent. We've had some good games from Dylan. We've had some good games from Ryan. But, the matter of them putting together, 5, 6, 7, 8 games consistently has not happened. Early in the year, I went to the idea that, hey, if you win, you play. And that wasn't working out too well, because just when they'd win a game, they'd come back with an average game. So I just went to the process of telling one he's playing Friday night, one he's playing Saturday. I changed the rotation occasionally, but that seemed to work better for us. Like, they're focusing on that one game that they have. And I think it's been better for us here in the second half. And, hopefully, we can get somebody just to, get some kind of a consistent level of play in net, because we're not going anywhere with a 90 save percentage in today's game. You got to be at the 92 plus, to have a chance to have a really good season. And, that's not just on goaltenders. It's also on how you play in front of them. But, I think that's probably one of the areas, special teams and goaltending both have been inconsistent in the first part of the season. This past weekend, we had both, and it certainly led us into a positive place.
We're speaking with Notre Dame head coach Jeff Jackson. You mentioned about having 60 more scoring chances than your opposition, and that brings to mind modern day analytics. People see a lot about the NHL and numbers and stats, but may not realize that there are a lot more numbers available to college hockey teams these days. How are you using analytics, and how does that affect practices and game strategy for you?
Well, we have a great director of hockey operations. Nick Sergey is probably one of the best in the business, including the National Hockey League, and we're fortunate that we have him. And he works very diligently in doing an entire analytics package after every game, and then we do it, in segments as well. And I look at that. Obviously, the eye test for me, I'm still old school. Like, what I see is how I coach, but they do reinforce my feelings sometimes. And then they also surprise me sometimes, maybe we need to take a look at somebody like Grant Silanoff, a freshman, at the 10 game mark. He was a lot more productive in scoring chances than some of our older guys. And, so we elevated him to, one of our top 3 lines. He had been playing primarily on a 4th line role. And he's also been he's got 4 goals for us as a freshman, which is, decent in 10 games. But, it does have an impact sometimes in causing us to take a look at different guys in different situations. And there's value to them, but, I'm not as in, the Corsi numbers are just evidence to me that we possess the puck more than the opponent. But I don't look at Corsi beyond that necessarily. I am, really into, evaluating scoring chances, where they're coming from, how they developed. Are they, from transition? Are they from possession? What area of the ice are they coming out? Are they long transition chances? Are they short transition chances off your forecheck? I look at those things to maybe we do need to work on certain parts of our game a little bit more in practice. So they do give you some indication of, areas that maybe you're not as efficient on your breakout as the opponent is, which, allows you to, to focus more on the things that you need to improve on.
More with Jeff Jackson in a moment.
This is the USCHO Spotlight, a weekly podcast from US College Hockey Online.
Continuing now with Notre Dame head coach Jeff Jackson. When we look around the different leagues in college hockey, some of them have had a really difficult time getting schedules in. And as we look at it, it seems as if the Big Ten has had the best fortune in making that happen. Are there some things that you can attribute that to in planning the season and maybe getting a lot of those games in before Christmas?
We've had a few guys, miss games because of COVID, not always testing positive, but maybe contact tracing, things like that. But, I give the Big Ten credit in the fact, we're the rest of our athletic department's basically operating on, ACC rules. We're the only team on campus that's operating on the Big Ten rules, and we're testing every morning before we practice. And that really eliminates the spread. When they do find somebody that has tested positive, they remove them, and maybe anybody they've had close contact with for at least until they get the secondary test. Then we've had guys that have been able to come. The guys who are contact tracing, they've been able to come back because they've been tested with the more intense test, so they can come back quickly. Because, it might have been a false positive. And we've had a few of those. So for us, and I know it would probably apply to the whole conference is, even when we're on the road, like this past weekend, and we tested over at the football stadium each day we were at Minnesota. And, you're generally cleared within 20 minutes, and, that clears you for the day. And, there's been a couple issues thus far, like I know, with the cancellation of the one Wisconsin-Michigan State series, and then Wisconsin pushing their weekend back. This weekend was Arizona having some issues. There's been some, but they haven't caused many cancellation or postponements at this point in time. That's not to say it still couldn't happen, but I think just the diligence of the testing and then the follow-up testing has been pretty positive experience as far as having to deal with this this awful situation that everyone's going through.
In addition to the daily testing, what kind of things has COVID protocol affected in your weekly and in your game day routine?
I look so forward to getting in my car and getting home to take the mask off. It's very, it really impacts the communication with your team, your ability to communicate with your players. They can't see a smile or frown or whatever it may be. It's hard to hear on the bench. It's not conducive to teaching. It's not conducive to education. You have to pull everybody in, and they still have to be at some distance when you pull them in. We ended up getting a big marker board that's probably 6 feet long and 4 feet tall, so they can socially distance when we go over anything that we're touching on in practice. We're still kind of spread out in our locker room suite where we have half the team in the locker room and half the team is in our player lounge for distancing purposes. They have to time when they go into shower and things like that. So they can't all be there in there at the same time. And they don't have utilization to a lot of our facility. Like they don't have the players lounge right now. They don't have our meal room. We do have our auditorium because it's big enough to house the whole team with 6 foot distancing, and then they all have masks on in all the meetings. So it's definitely a unique, hopefully once in a lifetime negative experience that everybody has to deal with. And and I give our guys a tremendous amount of credit because they're college kids. They want to have fun. They missed out on the fun of the football season of tailgating and hanging out together in the parking lot before football games. They miss out probably on, post-game get-togethers after, a big win or something like that. They're really limited as far as, going to restaurants or going to movies. And we have, we have rented movie theaters a few times for them to go to watch movies. They actually did that last night, where they have the whole theater spread out. Different restaurants and different venues like that are renting out the whole facility for one group at a very inexpensive price because they're looking for business. So it's been a challenge, no question about it. And, the old saying is, if it doesn't kill you, it makes you stronger. Unfortunately, this pandemic has killed a lot of people, but I'm just grateful that, our guys are all healthy. And, for the most part, our university's done an incredible job of making sure that the student body, including the athletes, are, staying healthy. We had the one initial scare when they got back to school, but other than that, it's been handled very professionally by the health professionals and our university and certainly the Big Ten Conference.
Even with a focus on the ice during the game, you've got to miss the fan base that is so loyal there, and hearing the Notre Dame Victory March live. Do you notice a difference in that? Is there a difference in energy in the building because of that?
Well, there's no question about that, and I'm sure that applies everywhere. Like when you play on the road, it's always, Minnesota, Michigan. Those are only 4 road games thus far. Those environments, those venues are awesome. They're usually filled and loud, and there's no question it's different. And I know that our guys talked about it early on, that we have to try to generate our own enthusiasm, our own excitement on the bench, and just trying to play the game, but try to ignore in many situations you try to get them to ignore the crowd noise and that. But there's no question, after you've played in that environment your whole life or your whole career, at Notre Dame or even prior or after that, you're always accustomed to having the fans in the stands, and it's no question it's different. But when the puck drops, generally you're focused on playing the game, and but it does have an influence on how the game momentum changes without the crowd. Those momentum changes don't exist right now, so they're more created by the teams themselves, and it makes for a different environment, no question. It makes for probably a frustrating environment for especially the seniors that look forward to their senior year and all the different positive things that go with it. It's just another element that the pandemic has taken away from them. And, I'm just grateful that, they're still getting their degree and they're still getting to play hockey. And, for a long time, we weren't sure all this was going to happen.
We're talking with Notre Dame head coach Jeff Jackson. And Jeff, I look at this weekend upcoming 2-game series against Michigan at home. You've already played these Wolverines on the road and pulled off a sweep back in what seems like years ago, but it was around Thanksgiving. And here we are. You're coming off a good weekend. Michigan coming off a good weekend. Both teams pretty hot. What do you see in this Michigan team when you look at them, and what kind of challenges do they typically pose?
Well, it was probably good for us to play Minnesota this past weekend because they have a lot of similarities to Minnesota as far as their speed and their skill. They've got a very, talented roster top to bottom. Every position is strong. They don't have a weak link in their lineup. They're a very deep team with skill and ability, and they don't get the credit for it all the time, and we always hear about it, but Michigan never hears about it. But their structure is pretty good. Their defensive structure, their 1-3-1 in the neutral zone. Their system, they really pack it in the D zone. They swarm you. They don't give you a lot of time to make plays. But they, Mel's done a great job there, not just from a recruiting perspective, but also how his teams play. And the second half of last year they started coming on, and I would assume that young group early in the year with so many freshmen kind of feeling their oats. Now they've got some games under their belt. They're starting to get some confidence, and they're going to be a scary team, I think, for anybody here in the second half because they have that ability level to break you down and make plays one-on-one for sure.
That should be a pretty good series this weekend, and you're coming off playing a team that plays some pretty good defense, has some good goaltending. You're going to see that again this weekend. So we look forward to this one for certain, and we always appreciate your time, Jeff. So good luck the rest of the way. stay healthy, and we hope to talk to you maybe down the road toward the NCAA tournament time.
Yeah, same to you, Jim. Appreciate it. We'll hopefully see you at tournament time.
That's Notre Dame's Jeff Jackson. Jim, it's always a pleasure to talk to Jeff Jackson. And it was funny when we started talking about analytics, he referred to being old school, and certainly he's had decades of success behind benches of a couple of programs. But it's also fascinating to hear how numbers can kind of flesh out a story or inform the eye test, as he put it.
You know what? And that's what it is. And, I didn't know where he would go when he answered that. I've known Jeff long enough to know that he is, he's old school. I'm not going to call him old. The man still looks young. Obviously, is, lively and energetic behind the bench. But he is old school. He comes from, a successful coaching career that began in the 80s. And back then, there were, you just really had to look at things and break things down with VCRs and slow rewinding and fast forwarding. And the world's changed. And now you have so much that supports what you see and what you don't see. And that is what analytics really does. And, I think also video and video coaching has come a long way in that same amount of time. And not surprisingly, you're not going to be a successful coach if you don't kind of follow trends. And he's followed the trend, which is to, really embrace and get your team to embrace as well the analytics of the game and make adjustments. And, he talked about, a freshman forward who was playing a little bit better in terms of burying his chances. And you give that person more opportunity, you put them up into a top 3 position, maybe they become even more productive. And if maybe it's not that they start scoring goals and just, throw hat tricks in every game. It's just that they might produce more. And if you're at least producing offense, you're not going to be giving up the chances at the other end. So I think that all of that stuff goes into what analytics can be in terms of a paycheck. But I'm still in the same boat as Jeff Jackson. I think a lot of it for me still comes down to the eye test as well.
We've been wondering why the Big Ten has been doing so much better in getting games in, and I think Jeff Jackson put his finger on it. Daily testing in the Big Ten seems to have been the difference in them being able to get games in and isolating individual players instead of shutting down whole teams.
Correct. I think that, we've talked about this. It's kind of a haves versus a have-not. So that takes a lot of resources and money. And that's a commitment that you have to make as a university, as a hockey program, to make sure that you're going through the testing process, doing it every day, and then have kind of that grid of what's going to happen once somebody tests positive. You're testing on these not as conclusive tests, then you go and get a full test. And you might have to take the person who tested positive, all the people that they've been in contact with in the last 24, 48, 72 hours, whatever it is. Everybody then goes and does another round of testing. That's when you start isolating from each other. But, you heard him talk about how he's had to play some games without players because of COVID testing. As we discussed in yesterday's weekend review podcast, we've seen a lot of programs, they get one test and they just shut down. So there's a big difference, and that I think is what has made this league, the Big Ten, the most successful in terms of getting games played, getting them played on time. There's other leagues that have had some success. I really do highlight the NCHC and what they did in their pod. They've had some cases and some postponements and some shifting since then, but nothing like we've seen out in Atlantic Hockey and Hockey East, where those conferences has really struggled with trying to get games played and get consistency in anybody's schedule.
Well, it's always great to have a chance to talk to a legend, Jeff Jackson. For Jim Connelly, I'm Ed Trefzger, and we'll catch you next time.
This has been the USCHO Spotlight, a production of U.S. College Hockey Online. Visit uscho.com/podcasts to listen or subscribe.